So the first test that we're going to cover is unit testing. And like I said, this test covers a single unit of code, which is usually a function. So how does unit testing work? So let's say you have a function, f of x, let's say, and you want to test this function. So with the unit test, you first define and give it its inputs. So these are the inputs. You pass it into the specific function. And given those inputs, you check whether the outputs are the correct ones that you would expect to get. There's even a pattern or methodology to doing unit testing, and it's called AAA. You arrange, act, and then assert. So if you look at a very, very simple example, incrementing a counter, a test would look like this. So you define the test, you say this is a test, and the test is defined in here. So the first one in the AAA is arrange. That means you set up your counter object here. You act, you increment that counter, and then you assert that the value should now be 1. And that's pretty much the gist of unit testing. Now what we're going to do some unit testing on our to-do app. So this is our to-do app. If you remember from the previous lessons, we're able to complete and delete all these to-dos. So since we're doing unit testing, we want to test the functions of our application. And usually for me, that means anything to do with the state notifier provider that we set up. This is where the data gets managed, and this is where the actual functions of the application are. So we have the add to do function, we have complete to do function, and then we have delete to do function. Now, since we are using RiverPod, there's a little bit of setup we're going to need to do for our unit test, but in general, these are the functions you want to test, and this is what we're going to be testing in this lesson. So for unit testing, you don't actually need to really have the application pulled up. I was going to keep it here so we could have something to fill out the screen. But to first create the unit test, you have to create a test folder within the root of your directory, and then your unit test should be labeled _test. So in this case, we're going to have it unit_test.dart. Now inside, you have some different things that you could do. So first, there is a setup function that you could call, and you'll see it asks for a body, but we're actually going to use a setup function. There is a teardown function, which we're not going to use. And another one is the actual test we want to have. So you'll see they need a description and the actual body of the test. What setup does, it runs before every single test. So let's say let's define some tests that we're going to actually do. We're going to have a to-do list starts empty test. We're going to have an add to-do test. And so now every time we go to each of these tests, so let's say this to-do list starts empty test, it'll run through the setup, finishes, and then if we define something in a teardown, it will run through the teardown afterwards. So you kind of think of this as like a little loop. So if we define something in a setup, every time it's going to run at the beginning of our test, and the teardown is going to run, do the actual test here, and then the teardown is going to be at the very end. And it puts it into every single test that we have. In this section, we're only going to need a setup. And the reason we need a setup is because we're using provider. So the first thing we're going to need to do is set up something called a provider container. Now we're just going to call it container. And the setup function, we're going to set it container equal to provider container. That means every time we run each test, we're going to have a new provider container start up for us. Now, why do we need to use provider container? If you actually hover over it, within a Flutter application, you don't need to use it. But you do want to use this whenever you're testing because it stores the state of your provider without needing a provider scope. Remember the lessons from adding RiverPod here, we had a provider scope around the whole application because this is the thing that actually stores your state. Now, within a unit test, we're not running the application, so we need something else to store that state. And what we're going to use is this container. Now, the next part we need to set up for each test is the actual thing we're testing. So within the to-do provider, the thing we're actually testing is a to-do list notifier. This is the thing that has all the functions in it. So we're going to define our to-do list notifier out here and then assign it to be completely fresh every single time we run our test. So I'm going to do container.read to-do list provider.notifier. So now, every test we go into, we have a brand new fresh state of our application that we could work with. So let's get to actually adding the tests. The very first one is pretty simple. We don't need to do anything. We just get the initial value and want to make sure the initial value is an empty array. So to check that, you call this function called expect. Now expect needs two things. It needs the actual value and a matcher. So the matcher is the predefined value that we want it to have. We know it needs to be an empty array. And the actual is what we're actually testing for here. And that's our actual state, which is within this notifier. So to retrieve that, you do notifier.debug state. The debug state is how you access the state, and like it says in the description, this is very useful for tests. So that's our very first test, and we can actually run it by clicking this little green arrow in VS Code. You see when we run the test, the first test pass, and that means we're getting the right state. We're getting exactly what we expect from our default state within our to-do list. So now we get slightly more complicated. We can add a to-do item. Now to add one, since we're using Riverpod, it's pretty easy to add something to our state. We do notifier.add to-do. The way we defined it, our to-do state needs to add a piece of content in there. We'll do record video. Now using the AAA method, we have the arrange, which is kind of done in our setup over here. We have the act, which is actually adding the to-do. And then we have the assert, which is same thing as over here. We can copy paste. But now we're going to take the first item of the array, which should be our first to-do. So item 0. We're going to check the content, which is what we added into this to-do. And it should be equal to record video. If we save it, we can run this test by clicking the check mark. You see it's running the test, and it passed. Now if you're suspicious whether this is actually working, well, let's say we remove an E from video, save it, run this test again, you'll see what an error looks like within unit testing. So there you go. You'll get something like this. The actual value you have is record video, but you're saying you were expecting record video without the E. This is what an error would look like within unit testing, and then you could figure out what's going on. But we know exactly what's going on here, so we're just going to save it and move on. Now reload it, you see now the test passed again. So we have two other functions we want to test. We had add a to-do, then we also want delete to-do, and also complete to-do. So the reason I started the test this way with notifier add to-do is because we need it to do to be in there in order to be able to delete it. So we're going to add a to-do, check that to-do got added, and then we can go ahead and notifier.delete to-do, and we know the ID for this one should be 0. And the state should be exactly how we started with nothing in there. Now let's save it. I can run this test, see if delete to-do works properly, and it does. And you can see we got a check mark on delete to-do that it does run properly. Now last one, complete to-do. We can just double check to make sure that our completed value starts out as false. And then we can call notifier.complete to-do at index 0. And now this completed value for the first item within our array should be true. Now we can save it, we can open this test folder, and we can actually just run all of our tests. Make sure that every test is working and our code is good. There we go. 4 out of 4 tests passed. It means our application is working properly, and all of our functions within our state notifier provider are working just how we expect them to work.